Just curious. What device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
My mom walked in holding that familiar chipped ceramic mug she's had since the early 90s, the one with faded sunflowers and a hairline crack near the handle. And for some reason, that detail, how she hadn't even bothered to pour my tea into a clean cup, hit me harder than I expected. She placed it in front of me with that thin, papery smile stretched across her face, the kind of expression people wear when they know they've done something wrong but are too cowardly to own up to it. "Sorry we forgot your birthday," again, she said, as if it were some inside joke we all shared. Like forgetting me was a harmless tradition they'd long accepted, just another item on the family calendar marked in invisible ink. I looked up from the worn wooden table, my eyes scanning the room that still smelled like lemon pledge and cheap cinnamon candles, and it struck me, not for the first time, how little had changed since I left this house 5 years ago. The same tacky lace curtains hung limp in the kitchen window, the same cluttered fridge covered in old coupons, and Brooke's wedding photo, smiling with her perfect teeth and her perfect tan in that goddamn white dress. I remember sitting in that same chair on her wedding day, ignored as always, wearing a dress Mom picked out at the last minute, on clearance, and being told to stay out of the pictures because Brooke wanted a clean aesthetic. So when Mom placed the tea in front of me, acting like her words could patch over decades of being overlooked, something in me snapped, not loudly, not in some cinematic outburst, but in a slow, deliberate click. Like a lock sliding into place on a door I'd always been afraid to open. I thanked her, I smiled, and then I looked across the table at Brooke, who was laughing at something on her phone, legs crossed like a news anchor, looking as effortlessly curated as ever. She was sipping from a sleek white mug that read, "First class all the way," a recent gift from Dad to celebrate her Paris trip. I watched her, watched how she didn't even glance in my direction, and then, without a word, I reached out and gently switched our cups. It wasn't dramatic. She barely noticed. She was still laughing when she brought the sunflower mug to her lips, taking that first sip like nothing had happened. And I just sat back, wrapped my fingers around her mug, and took a quiet breath, feeling the strange electric stillness before a storm hits. You ever been forgotten so many times that you start to wonder if you were ever really there to begin with? If your presence is just some blurry shape in the background of their lives, important only when you're useful, like when someone needs a ride, or a loan, or a shoulder to cry on, when their perfect life takes a temporary detour. That's what it was like growing up with Brooke. She was the light, the joy, the emotional investment, while I was the functional daughter, the reliable one. The one who didn't cry too loud or ask for much, because I learned early that being small and quiet made life easier for everyone, except me. Brooke took another sip, her smile faltering slightly, her hand moving to her throat like something didn't sit right. She cleared her throat once, then again, louder this time, and then her eyes widened. She coughed, short and sharp, and I watched her shift in her chair, panic starting to crawl across her perfectly made-up face. Mom turned, startled, and asked, "Sweetie, you okay?" But Brooke couldn't answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, and then she stood up suddenly, clutching her chest. Mom rushed toward her, knocking over a vase of artificial flowers, water splashing across the table and dripping onto the floor. I stayed seated, calm, still, watching. Brooke was wheezing now, eyes wild, hands clawing at the air, as if she were trying to grasp at something she couldn't name. Then Mom looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like years. Her expression blank for a second before it twisted into something darker, more afraid. Her eyes dropped to the mug in my hands, the white mug, not the sunflower one. And then it hit her. She froze, and I just brought the mug to my lips and took a sip of water, just water because I hadn't touched the tea at all, and waited. Now maybe you're thinking this is insane. Maybe you're wondering what kind of woman just sits there while her sister gasps for breath across the table. But let me ask you something. How many times can someone erase you from every celebration, every family moment, every chance at being loved equally, before you start to wonder what your role in their story really is. Because here's what they won't tell you in those family therapy brochures and feel-good holiday movies. Sometimes the villain they warn you about wasn't born, she was made, one forgotten birthday at a time. And as Mom screamed for my father, and Brooke's knees hit the floor, and the mug rolled out of her hand and shattered, I didn't move. Not yet. You ever had a moment where everything suddenly made sense? Where all the little humiliations, the subtle digs, the birthdays with no calls, no cake, no card, where it all aligned into one sharp, clear image? That was my moment, and I wasn't about to waste it. They always said Brooke had a glow about her, that kind of effortless charm that made people lean in just a little closer when she spoke. A magnetism I never quite understood because I saw past the gloss, saw the way her smile tightened when she didn't get her way, saw how easily she lied without blinking, how quickly she cried crocodile tears if it meant dodging blame or manipulating a moment to suit her needs. From the outside, she was the golden child, the one who got hugs in the kitchen while I got lectures about responsibility, the one whose broken curfew was excused with a laugh and a boys will be boys, while I was grounded for leaving the porch light on. It was always that way, even when we were kids. Brooke got the last piece of cake, the bigger Christmas stocking, the seat up front in the car, and somehow I got a reputation for being difficult simply because I noticed. That afternoon, while paramedics shuffled into the house, dragging their clunky black bags and rattling oxygen tanks, while Mom hovered like a frantic shadow, and Dad stumbled out from the garage smelling like oil and cheap beer, asking what the hell happened. I stood in the hallway, not close enough to be in the way, but just far enough to watch them work, to watch how quickly Brooke became the center of the universe again. She lay on the floor gasping, her face blotched and red, eyes half closed. A trail of saliva streaked from the corner of her mouth, and Mom knelt beside her, holding her hand like it was some kind of lifeline, whispering, "Stay with us, baby, stay with us." Over and over, her voice cracking on the word baby, like it meant something sacred. They didn't even look at me. The strange thing is, I didn't feel satisfaction, not then. I didn't feel guilt either. What I felt was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when a lifetime of being ignored snaps into focus like a telescope adjusting. When the years of playing second fiddle, the years of being the one who understood, who didn't need as much, are suddenly exposed for what they are, a slow erosion of identity, a stripping away of value one silent moment at a time. A cop showed up not long after the ambulance, a younger guy with the kind of posture that screams new badge and no idea what to do with it. He took some notes, asked a few vague questions, and when he turned to me with that polite but forced tone, I saw in his eyes that he had no idea who I was in this picture. "Did you make the tea?" he asked, eyes flicking to the shattered mug on the floor, and I nodded because I had in a way. I'd accepted it, I'd taken it, I'd sat down and smiled while holding it. But I hadn't poured it, hadn't touched the pot or the kettle, hadn't been near the damn stove. I wasn't the one who prepared anything. I'd just been offered it, like always, late, lukewarm, and with no thought behind it. Before I could answer, Mom cut in too quickly, her voice sharp with panic. "It was me. I made the tea. I brought it to her." And for a second the air went still, as if she'd just realized the weight of what she said, as if it had slipped out before she could reframe it into something safe. The officer scribbled it down, nodded slowly, and turned back to me, this time with less certainty, as if the ground beneath his assumptions had cracked just a little. "So, she switched cups with her sister?" he asked, more a statement than a question, and all I did was nod again. No smile, no sarcasm, just a nod like someone agreeing with the weather. That night, after they took Brooke to the hospital and the house emptied out again, like it always does after chaos, suddenly silent, awkward in its stillness, I sat on the porch and thought about the last time I'd been in this house overnight. It was 3 years ago, after our uncle died, and Brooke had wailed like she'd lost a limb, even though she hadn't seen the man in 5 years, while I made all the calls, coordinated the funeral, found the will, and drove Mom to the cemetery in my old sedan with no heat. Nobody thanked me. Not then, not after. That night, too, they forgot I was there. I remembered one time, when I was maybe 10, Brooke had broken Mom's favorite vase, an ugly thing with peacocks and gold trim, a wedding gift from a cousin who smelled like mothballs. And before Mom could walk in, Brooke shoved the pieces under my bed and said, "Just say it was you, they won't be as mad." And I did, because I believed her, because I thought that's what sisters did. But it wasn't. What sisters do, real sisters, is fight for you, not hide behind you. As I sat outside, I could see the flickering light of the kitchen through the curtains, silhouettes moving slowly, shadows of people who were now scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong, who to blame, how to keep it from getting worse. And I realized something else, something I hadn't wanted to admit until now. Mom had brought me that tea not out of guilt, not as an apology, but out of habit. The kind of habit that comes when you expect someone to always take what they're given, to swallow it down and say thank you, no matter how bitter it tastes. Inside, the phone rang, a brief conversation, then quiet again. I didn't move. I waited. Because for the first time in years, they were all talking about me, even if they didn't know it yet. It's strange how quickly a house turns into a stage when something bad happens, how every object seems more symbolic, every silence more charged, every glance a kind of theater meant for someone else to witness. By the time the sun dipped behind the cracked maple in the backyard, casting long shadows through the kitchen window, I could feel the walls of that house pressing in with a kind of heaviness I hadn't felt since I was a teenager, suffocating in a bedroom full of trophies that didn't belong to me and expectations I never agreed to meet. The dishes were still stacked in the sink, untouched since before the ambulance came and Mom had retreated to her room without saying a word, leaving behind only the faint smell of her perfume, floral, cloying, fake as hell. I stood there for a while, just staring at the stove, replaying the moment she handed me that tea, her voice smooth but her eyes too sharp, too careful, like someone watching a bomb they're not quite sure is going to go off. I kept thinking about the way she'd looked at Brooke before she poured the tea, how her hand had hesitated slightly over the cup, how she'd whispered something I couldn't hear, while Brooke laughed with that fake, breathy giggle she always used when she wanted something. It wasn't just a forgotten birthday this time. There was something off about the whole setup. How quickly the apology came, how practiced it sounded, how conveniently Brooke just happened to be drinking out of the same mug I was supposed to have. And then it hit me, not in a dramatic flash, but in a slow, creeping realization that made my skin go cold. What if the tea wasn't meant for Brooke at all? What if it was meant for me? That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, because I still didn't feel any, but because my brain wouldn't stop unraveling the 100 tiny threads that led to this point, threads I'd ignored for too long, dismissed as bad luck or my own paranoia. I remembered one night last winter when I called home after my car spun out on black ice, and Mom didn't even ask if I was okay, just launched into a story about how Brooke had landed some marketing gig for a brand she couldn't even pronounce. I remembered how, at Dad's 60th birthday, they gave Brooke a gold watch and a toast, while I sat at the edge of the table eating cake with a plastic fork because they'd forgotten to save me a real place setting. And then I remembered something else, something that had bothered me at the time, but now felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. 2 nights ago, before I'd driven home for this surprise family dinner, I'd gotten a call from an unknown number. When I picked up, no one spoke, but I heard faint breathing and then a click. I wrote it off, but now I wasn't so sure. And earlier that day, before dinner, I'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom and passed by Brooke's old room. The door was cracked open, and I heard Mom's voice, low, tense, careful. She said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine. She won't even notice." I thought she meant dinner. I thought she was talking about the decorations, or maybe the burned rolls in the oven. But now I wasn't sure about anything. The next morning, while the house was still half asleep and Dad had gone off to pick up some papers at the hospital, I wandered into the living room and stood in front of the cabinet where Mom kept all her important things. Letters, medical files, old birthday cards Brooke had sent from Europe that she liked to display like trophies. I opened the drawer carefully, the one she always kept locked, unless she needed to pull out tax documents or photos for Christmas letters. There was a stack of envelopes, some yellowed with age, some newer, and one of them was addressed to Brooke in Mom's familiar cursive. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe I already knew what I'd find. Maybe I just needed to see it in her words. Inside was a short note, just a few lines. "Don't worry, she'll never suspect anything. Just smile and be sweet. We'll make it through this like always, Mom." There was no date, no context, no explanation, but my name wasn't in it, not once. And there was something about the certainty in that first sentence that made my chest tighten, that made the edges of the room feel farther away, as if I'd stepped into someone else's memory by accident. I folded the note, slid it back, and closed the drawer softly, feeling like I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Not legally, not even morally, but emotionally. As if by reading it, I'd finally admitted to myself that this family had never really seen me as one of their own, not in the way they saw Brooke. I was support staff, scaffolding, background. And maybe, just maybe, they had wanted to keep it that way, permanently. By noon, the hospital called to say Brooke was stable, but still groggy. Some kind of reaction to something they hadn't identified yet. But she was breathing on her own, and the test didn't show anything obviously toxic. Mom relaxed visibly when she heard, the tension sliding off her, like someone had loosened a rope around her neck. But she still wouldn't look at me directly. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about a birthday. This wasn't just about tea. This was about something deeper, darker, something that had been planned or at least considered. And even if it hadn't played out the way they wanted, it had been real enough in their minds that my mere survival was inconvenient. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with that realization. Not fully, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this slide. There's a particular kind of silence that creeps into a house not after a death, not even after a tragedy, but after a moment when everyone realizes they've been caught standing too close to the truth. When the curtain slips, and no one wants to be the one who pulls it all the way down. That silence had settled into the bones of the house by the time Brooke came home from the hospital 2 days later. Still pale, moving slowly, and wrapped in that same expensive shawl she wore at Thanksgiving when she wanted everyone to comment on how European she looked. The one she bought on a trip to Florence that Mom still refers to as Brooke's transformational journey. She walked through the front door like she owned the place, like the memory of gasping for breath on the linoleum floor had already been buried under a new narrative, one that painted her as the victim of an unfortunate mix-up, the center of everyone's concern once again. I watched from the stairs, my fingers curling tight around the railing, and I realized something I hadn't quite admitted out loud yet, not even to myself. Brooke didn't look scared. She looked annoyed, tired maybe, slightly inconvenienced, but not like someone who'd had a brush with death. And Mom, who practically flung herself at her the moment she walked in, wasn't crying with relief. She was scanning the room, eyes darting from me to Dad and back to Brooke, like she was waiting for someone to say something, anything, that could rewrite what happened into a version of the story she could live with. Later that night, when the house had quieted again, and Brooke was in the guest room upstairs, likely texting her concerns to one of her polished, well-groomed friends, I found Mom in the kitchen, hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the same bowl over and over like she could erase whatever stain had been left by the past few days. I didn't speak right away, just leaned against the doorframe and watched her, waiting for her to acknowledge me, to offer something. An explanation, an apology, even a lie. Anything but this stubborn, terrified silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, brittle, the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to cry, but aren't entirely sure if they're sad or just cornered. "She's okay," she said, as if that settled everything, as if I hadn't been the one holding the wrong mug, the one who was supposed to be coughing on the floor while Brooke clutched pearls and screamed for help. The doctor said it wasn't poison, just a reaction, cinnamon or something. I didn't respond. I just stared at her, and after a moment she turned, drying her hands on a dish towel. Eyes narrowed, not angry but wary, the way someone looks when they realize the person they've spent years underestimating is no longer playing along. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Not in the curious way mothers are supposed to ask. Not in the way that invites trust or vulnerability, but like a warning, like she was daring me to say what she already suspected. I didn't hesitate. "I think you were hoping it would be me." She flinched, just slightly, just enough for the mask to slip, and for a flicker of something cold and ancient to pass across her face. And then, in a voice I didn't recognize, she said, "Don't be ridiculous, Allison. You always take things so personally." It was the same line she used when I cried after Brooke flushed my science project down the toilet in 8th grade. It was the same line she used when Dad forgot to pick me up from a choir competition and I waited in the rain for 3 hours, watching every other kid get swept up in hugs and warm cars. It was always my fault somehow, my reaction, my sensitivity, my inability to just let things go. But this time, I didn't let it go. I stepped into the kitchen, closer, and said, "You wrote her a note. You told her I wouldn't suspect anything. What was that about?" For a second, just a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh, not the kind that reaches the eyes, but that dry, humorless sound people make when they've been caught and don't want to admit it. "You're digging, sweetheart," she said. "That note was old. Something about your father's birthday surprise. You're always making things bigger than they are." But she was lying. I knew it. She knew it. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. It didn't even sting. It just made everything clearer. I asked her one more question before I left the room, my voice steady and quiet, like I was reading a recipe or giving someone directions. "If it had been me on the floor, gasping, turning blue, would you have called an ambulance just as fast?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because the answer was obvious and saying it out loud would have made it real. And she wasn't ready for that kind of truth, not even now. As I walked upstairs, I passed Brooke's door, which was cracked open slightly, just enough for me to see the glow of her phone screen against her face. She wasn't sleeping. She hadn't been for hours. She was listening. And from the look in her eyes, she hadn't liked what she heard. In that moment, I realized something else. Brooke wasn't scared of dying. She was scared of not being the center anymore. She was scared that whatever control she had, over Mom, over the narrative, over how we all played our roles, was slipping. And nothing scared Brooke more than not being in charge of the story. But what she didn't know, what none of them had figured out yet, was that I hadn't come home to be the quiet one anymore. I came back to make sure they finally saw me, and they would. By the time the weekend came to its suffocating end, the house, once filled with movement and chatter and the artificial chaos that only truly dysfunctional families can generate under the guise of togetherness, had become so quiet, so still, that even the smallest sounds, a floorboard creaking under my foot, the refrigerator humming its tired rhythm, the slow, methodical clicking of Brooke's fingernails against her phone screen, seemed too loud, too intrusive, as if the very air between us had thickened into something solid and accusatory. Dad, ever the master of avoidance, had taken off early that morning to run errands, a task that conveniently seemed to last the entire day, and Mom had retreated into the backyard under the guise of gardening, though all she really did was sit beside the bird bath, clutching a mug of black coffee and staring into the hedges like they might blink back at her. Brooke remained mostly in her room, emerging only to hover in the kitchen just long enough to complain about the hospital food or ask where her white noise machine had gone, pretending not to notice the way I stared at her each time she passed me, calm, composed, but with eyes that burned through every word she didn't say. She was quieter now, more deliberate in her movements, as if the lingering taste of near death had burned away the last of her performative charm, leaving behind a version of her that was meaner, colder, and far more dangerous. It wasn't fear I saw in her, it was calculation, a quiet but relentless assessment of how she might rewrite the past few days, how she could once again pull the story back into her orbit and cast herself as the misunderstood center. What she hadn't figured out yet was that the narrative wasn't hers anymore. Not this time. That afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Mom standing by the counter, not doing anything, just standing, staring at a pile of unopened mail like it was a minefield. The silence stretched long between us until she finally broke it, her voice low, resilient, but still with that edge of defensiveness that always rose when she felt cornered but not guilty. "They said it was an allergic reaction," she muttered, not looking at me, not moving. "Probably cinnamon. Brooke's always been sensitive, you know that." I nodded slowly, and then very deliberately, I reached into the cabinet, pulled out the small dusty spice jar with the faded cinnamon label, and placed it gently on the counter between us. She didn't flinch, but I saw the muscle in her jaw twitch, a betrayal her carefully still face couldn't quite suppress. "It was in the tea," I said, and she responded with silence. Not denial, not even surprise, just that heavy, complicated pause that happens when someone realizes there's no longer a clean exit. I stepped closer, not in aggression, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed proof, who wasn't asking for a confession but laying down a verdict. "You added it, I watched you. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you thought I wouldn't notice. But I saw you shake something in. Brooke didn't see. She never watches, but I did." Mom looked at me then, really looked. Her expression empty of the usual superiority or scorn, replaced by something more primitive, something closer to dread. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling, so quiet I almost missed it. "It was just meant to calm things down." And there it was, not an apology, not a confession, but something far more dangerous. Justification. She wasn't sorry for what she did, or tried to do. She was only sorry that it hadn't gone the way she'd planned. She hadn't meant to kill me, of course not. That would have been too direct, too final. No, she wanted something else. Maybe to scare me, maybe to silence me, maybe just to remind me that even now, even in adulthood, I was still the expendable one, the one who could be sidelined if she became inconvenient. But by swapping the cups, by giving Brooke the mug that was meant for me, I had disrupted the one thing this family relied on to function, the unspoken agreement that I would always take the hit. That night, I sat in the living room while Brooke packed her bags upstairs, her voice drifting down through the walls in a steady monologue of complaints and passive-aggressive suggestions to Mom about getting rid of stressful influences, as if I were a leak in the roof or a mildew problem in the basement. I sat there, calm, sipping my own tea, no cinnamon this time, and waited. And then, as if summoned by the weight of everything left unsaid, Brooke appeared in the doorway, suitcase in hand, expression poised somewhere between exhaustion and contempt. She looked at me the way someone looks at a broken appliance, annoyed, confused, and vaguely resentful that it ever worked in the first place. "You really think you've won something here, don't you?" she said, her voice brittle, her composure a thin veneer stretched over panic. "You think this changes anything?" I didn't answer right away. I just set the cup down carefully, folded my hands, and let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. And then finally I said, "It already did. You just don't know it yet." She sneered, turned, and wheeled her suitcase toward the door. And for a moment I wondered if she would say anything else, if there was some final dagger she'd try to throw. But she didn't. She just left, the door slamming behind her like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read out loud. And then, for the first time in my adult life, I looked around that house, the one I had been born in, ignored in, humiliated in, and felt something like peace, not because the truth had set anyone free, but because I had finally stopped begging it to. In the end, there was no poison, there was only cinnamon. But sometimes that's all it takes, just the right dose at the right moment to bring the whole illusion crashing down. And as I sat there in the quiet, watching the sky darken through the window, I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I finally understood something I should have known a long time ago. They were never going to choose me. So I stopped waiting to be chosen.